is Grube, and you are watching ABC News. Over the course of the war, there are many famous broadcasters that broadcasted their type of propaganda. Propaganda happened all throughout the nations that served in the war and on both Allied and Axis sides. Here are 5 of the most famous broadcasters using their propaganda. Several American Nazi sympathizers worked as broadcasters for a German state radio, but perhaps none was as famous as Mildred Gillers. Born in Maine, Gillers was a former Broadway showgirl who moved to Berlin in 1934. She remained in Germany after the war broke out and eventually became the Third Reich's most prominent radio personality, with a Home Sweet Home propaganda show directed at American troops. Gillers broadcasted under the radio handle Midge, but American GIs soon gave her a more infamous nickname, Axis Sally. Axis Sally spoke in a friendly, conversational tone, but her goal was to unsettle her listeners. One of her favorite tactics was to mention the soldiers' wives and girlfriends, and then muse about whether the women would remain faithful. Prior to the Allied invasion of France, she also starred in a radio play called Vision of Invasion, as an American mother whose son needlessly drowns during the attack. Like a lot of propaganda, Gillers' radio rarely had their desired effect. Many GIs only listened because they found them funny. She was still considered a traitor by the US government, and hopefully she winds up behind bars. Nothing like our American troops to sift through what's real and what's not real. Beginning of 1939, millions of Britons regularly tuned into a German propaganda broadcast hosted by a smug Nazi sympathizer nicknamed Lord Haw-Haw. Although several men were identified with the name, it was most famously associated with William Joyce, an American-born fascist who spent most of his life in the United Kingdom. Joyce was an outspoken acolyte. Speaking in a clipped, cosmopolitan British accent, Joyce's Lord Haw-Haw dished out taunts and pro-Hitler rants intended to break the spirit of his beleaguered listeners. In between facing Jews and the British government, he would gleefully report on his most recent casualties of the Blitz, often warning his audience to expect further punishment from the German Luftwaffe. Joyce's influence waned in the later years of the war, and he was eventually captured near Flensburg, Germany in 1945. British troops recognized his famous voice. That's how he got captured. He was found guilty of aiding the enemy. Britain's most famous turncoat was executed by hanging earlier this year. As head maestros of British black propaganda radio programs, Sefton Delmer used a cloak and dagger method to turn the airwaves into a tool for his psychological warfare. Beginning in 1941, Delmer operated a phony German radio station called Gustav Siegfried I, or GS1 as it was most commonly known as. Unlike most propaganda outfits which merely beam their message into enemy territory, GS1 was an actual Nazi radio station broadcasting to fellow Germans from within the fatherland. To act as the voice of GS1, Delmer masterminded the creation of a fake radio personality known as Der Chief, or the Chief in German. Played by a German defector named Peter Seckelmann, the character posed as a high-ranking Nazi and loyal Hitler supporter who appeared delusioned with the rest of his party leadership. Der Chief built his credibility by criticizing the British and the Russians, but he also rallied against Nazi officials and generals, helping to create the appearance of a rift within the German high command. Among other tactics, he also accused Nazi leaders of having tainted the party with acts of sexual deviancy ranging from rape to pedophilia. To cement his role as a persecuted patriot, Der Chief was even assassinated on air during GS1's final broadcast in the late 1943. Delmer now still sets up many propaganda stations, including Soldenstander, Calais, which poses as a German station for troops in France, which spread targeted disinformation to Nazi U-boats in the Atlantic. As early as 1939, Germany began hiring Americans to host radio programs aimed at deterring U.S. intervention with the war. These American-born fascists included Robert Henry Best, an ex-journalist who used the handle Mr. Guess Who, and Jane Henderson, better known as the Georgia Peach. Still, perhaps the most enthusiastic broadcaster was Fred W. Kaltenbach. A former Iowa high school teacher, Kaltenbach had been first hired in 1936 after he tried to organize an American copy of the Hitler Youth. Following his dismissal, he moved to Berlin and became host of one of the first German radio programs produced for Americans. He soon earned the nickname Lord Hee-Haw for his homespun style and the similarity to the British propagandist Lord Haw-Haw, as mentioned before. Kaltenbach's show took the form of fictional letters to his American friends back home, in which he championed a policy of isolationism and rallied against the evils of the Jews in the British Empire. After the United States entered the conflict, he began broadcasting pro-Nazi news, along with attacks on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom he labeled as a warmonger. Kaltenbach's diatribe saw him charged with treason, along with 7 other American propagandists. He never faced trial because he disappeared shortly after the war ended, and he was later reported to have died in Soviet custody. In 1935, Edward R. Murrow was hired by CBS to serve as its director of talks. He moved to London, England 2 years later to become the head of its operations. Nearly by accident, Murrow began his career in journalism. Germany invaded Austria in 1938, and he chartered a plane to Vienna, Austria, where he covered the event for CBS. Soon, he developed a network of correspondents to help him report on the growing conflict in Europe. His team, sometimes called Murrow's Boys, included William L. Schreier and Eric Severeid. Murrow became a fixture on American radio during World War II. During the late 1939 to early 1940, he risked life and limb to report on the bombing of London. Murrow transmitted his reports from a rooftop instead of an underground shelter and was able to make the Blitz real for listeners across the pond. Murrow burned the city of London in our houses, and we felt the flames that burned in it. He was also the first to incorporate ambient sounds into his broadcast, allowing listeners to hear the news happening. Ladies and gentlemen, what I just read to you are 5 important broadcasters during World War II. Many of them skewed news stories with propaganda benefiting their own side. So I please ask you, be careful what you listen to, and make sure you stay away from the fake news. From Grube and all of ABC.